Welcome back everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in today's course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administration exam. In this video we're going to be in our HTTP services section, and we're going to talk about setting up name-based virtual web hosts in Apache. So we're going to divide this into 4 videos for this one topic, and the reason being is there are 2 major methods of setting up vhosts on our system, and we have to deal with vhosts that are specific for HTTP as well as HTTPS and how to enable that for our system. Now, if you want to know how to generate OpenSSL self-signed certificates, which we will do as part of the 4 videos that we'll cover, you can see the video that covers that in detail for setting up self-signed certificates in Apache. We're just going to generate the tickets without talking a lot about the OpenSSL protocol and how it generates those self-signed certificates and what they mean. So what we're going to start with today is we're going to start with an Ubuntu system that we're going to set up name-based virtual hosts for. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to use apt-get to install Apache 2, the latest Apache 2 in the repo. Now, when this installs, we'll talk about vhosts in general. Now, there's always going to be default vhosts once you set up Apache and it's running, so that the system knows that by IP or any name that points to that particular IP to answer in the default location for the HTML requests. In this case, if we go to the name or the IP address for this particular server, we should get the default web page. However, that's not specifically set up for any particular name nor any particular path that contains files for a specific website. So there's a couple of things that we need to do that we in order to set up a name-based virtual host. So the first thing we need to know is we need to know what name are we going to be setting that up for, and then what directory structure might we want to use to put our files in. So by default, the website files are installed in var www html, and you'll see, at least in Ubuntu, an index.html file that contains the default page. So if we are remotely logged into our Linux Academy lab server, we'll go ahead and bring up a remote browser, and let's go to HTTP and then the IP of the server that we're connected to, which in this case is HTTP 52.3.211.56. And we'll get the Apache Ubuntu default page, and which is fine, because even if I refer to this by name, which in my case for this particular lab server is tcox5.mylabserver.com, I should also get that default Apache web page, because I don't have anything set up that would point to a path or anything else that would answer for it. So I'm just going to get that default web page. But what I can do is I can create anywhere off of the HTML directory, which is the easiest way to do it, because then I have all of my my websites in one location. Is I can drop down to var www, and for example, I can just make a directory called, since my server is called tcox5, I'm just going to put tcox5 in. So tcox5 will be where we want our website for tcox5.mylabserver.com, and you'll name your directory and your eventual virtual host name based upon the virtual host that you want to answer. It's the easiest way to differentiate those different virtual hosts. So let's make a very simple index.html file that differentiates itself from the default. So if I just do a vim, in my case, on index.html, then all I'm going to do is say HTML. This is a very, very simple HTML file. All I want it to do is be different than the default HTML page. So I'm going to say header2 tcox5.mylabserver.com, so I know that it's the one that I created, and we'll then end the HTML file. All right, so now that we've got var www tcox5 in index.html, and we're not going to change the defaults, index.htm or HTML are going to be the files, if they exist, that the right path will point to that your web browser will bring up. In Ubuntu, we are going to go to the etc Apache 2 directory. Now, the configuration for Apache in Ubuntu is such that it uses external directories to pull in configuration, modules, and sites for each of those three sections. So the Apache configuration file, if we cap that out, this is the equivalent to the httpd.configuration file if we were running on a Red Hat or CentOS system. The last three items will tell us these include optional directories: sites enabled, conf enabled, etc. Now, the difference being is that they have available and enabled, and they're only including what's enabled. And that's because the available directory is designed to contain configuration files that you may have but are not currently in use. And then when they're ready to be used, they are linked into the enabled directory using a couple of special utilities. So let's take a look at the sites. That's what we're going to concentrate on here because that's where our vhosts are. So if we go to sites available, these are not necessarily what's enabled. These are what's available. We see 000-default.conf and default SSL. If we go to sites enabled, we'll see that the only one that's currently enabled is default, which is why we get that IP and name that points to our default site. So let's go back to sites enabled, or available rather. And the first thing we want to do is let's make a configuration file specifically for the directory that we created. So let's do a copy of 000, and then we're going to say tcox5.mylabserver.com, and you could just at this point put .conf, but since we're also going to be talking about SSL in a subsequent video, let's make sure that we identify which configuration file is specific to each protocol. Now, there's a couple of schools of thought on separating HTTP from HTTPS. I tend to separate HTTPS because I may start my HTTPS connections using a different index file, using a different logging format, any number of things. It's going to answer for the same server, but it's also going to answer based on the protocol. So in this case, I'm going to say tcox5mylabserver_http.conf. We'll go ahead and clear this. And now we just need to edit the tcox5 configuration and make it specific for our instance. So if we say tcox5 my lab server, there's a whole bunch of commentary in here that helps guide you for the setup for a vhost. But the few items that we're interested in are server admin, document root, error log, and custom log. We're going to add this server name directive. And now from a server perspective, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. So the server name is intended to be the actual domain, the full domain that you're going to be answering for, which in our case is tcox5.mylabserver.com. A lot of times, though, your server name will be your base domain. So in our scenario, tcox5.mylabserver.com, it would normally be my lab server, and then we would use a server alias to differentiate tcox5.mylabserver.com so that I could have multiple names on the server name, and the server alias would answer it just exactly the same. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to say tcox5.mylabserver.com, and all we're going to do is change that. We're going to, the document root in this case is not var.dub.html, it's tcox5, and we're not going to mess with the error log or the custom log. Again, if we had a fully qualified domain name where the base domain was my lab server, what we could put is we could put server alias, and I'm commenting that out here, for example, and you would put tcox5.mylabserver.com as well. But we could also do tcox5 as just a server alias so that if I was doing local browsing, I wouldn't have to use the fully qualified domain name. I could just refer to it as tcox5. At the very top where we define the virtual host, we'll also be defining the port that this website will be listening on. Now, I can use a non-standard port in my virtual host. Let's save this file and exit. If in the ports configuration file, which is again different from how CentOS and Red Hat use it, if in the ports configuration I had the listen statement listening for a web connection on that port. And we'll talk about the SSL stuff here in a subsequent video. So now we have the site available, but we haven't enabled that site. So let's go back to the sites available, and you don't have to do this from the available directory. I just want to list out what we've got. So now in this case, we want to do a A2EN site on tcox5.mylabserver.com_http.conf. That enables the site, and the way that it enables the site is it does what you would normally have to do manually, which would be to link this file to the same file in sites enabled. But let's look at that. If we go to sites enabled, now we see that that virtual host has been enabled, which therefore will include the configuration when we restart Apache. We happen to be running on an Ubuntu 14.04 LTS system, which is still a sysvinit system. So in our case, we're going to do a service httpd restart, or rather, sorry, Apache 2 restart. And if we have any errors in the configuration, it should come up here. Now, if we go back to our internet browser, we'll bring that back up here. Whereas before, we had HTTP and then the IP address of 52.3.211.56, which is the default page. Now we should be able to go to tcox5.mylabserver.com, and we get the different web page, even though it's the same IP, but we've pointed to a different directory in our configuration by name, so that if you just come to this IP, or the default will also answer for anything that that IP is configured for. So we could have 10 DNS entries that all point to this IP address. And the only time it's going to come to a vhost other than the default is if the name in the vhost, either the server name or the server alias, matches the name that it is making the request to. So in this case, we are matching tcox5.mylabserver.com. So instead of going to var www.html, the named vhost goes to var www.tcox5, which contains our custom index.html file. Now, the great thing about Apache is we can configure Apache to answer for hundreds of domains on the same IP address, all of them differentiated by name and path to a different site directory. So, and then the default can function as the catch-all for everything else. And in Ubuntu, we use these nice little utilities, A2ENMod, and for disabling it, for example, would be A2DIS, or A2EN site, and then A2DIS site, which would be disabling site and enabling site. We do the same thing with configurations and modules, but we'll talk about that in the SSL video as well. But for setting up named vhosts on Ubuntu, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.